For 7 years, every Tuesday morning without fail, a white refrigerated delivery truck from Hargrove Food Group pulled up behind the same small restaurant on the edge of Millhaven, Ohio, and unloaded whatever ingredients the company's central kitchen no longer wanted. Bruised produce. Proteins a day past their internal deadline, bread loaves going stiff at the edges, no apology, no explanation, no discount. Just a clipboard, a signature line, and an invoice that never once reflected what was actually being delivered versus what had been ordered. The man who signed every one of those invoices was a chef, a real one, not the kind who appears on television holding tweezers over a smear of foam. The kind who learned to cook in his grandfather's kitchen in rural Tennessee at age 9, who could tell by smell alone when a stock had gone 20 minutes too long, who understood that feeding people well was not a performance, but a promise. His name was Arthur Dempsey, and he had been keeping that promise alone for a long time. Arthur was 43 years old, medium height, broad through the chest from years of carrying stockpots and sheet pans, gray starting at his temples, hands that bore a constellation of small scars from knives and oven racks, and the general violence of professional kitchens. He wore the same kind of worn work boots every day. The laces replaced so many times the replacement laces had been replaced. He drove a 2009 Silverado that needed a new alternator and would need it again in 6 months. He woke at 4:30 every morning, not because he set an alarm, but because his body had simply decided that 4:30 was when the day began, and it had been making that decision for so long that arguing felt pointless. The restaurant was called The Hollow Table. It seated 42 people in a converted hardware store on the western edge of town, where the manufacturing district began to blur into residential streets, and nobody was quite sure which neighborhood they were actually in. The sign out front was hand-painted by Arthur himself, dark green lettering on a cream background, and the O in hollow was slightly uneven, because he had sneezed midway through, and decided to leave it. It had been on that sign for 11 years. 11 years. That was how long Arthur had been running the Hollow Table, and for 7 of those 11 years, Hargrove Food Group had been his primary supplier. He had not chosen them out of admiration. He had chosen them because they offered volume pricing that let him keep his menu affordable, which mattered because his customers were not expense account diners. They were mill workers and school teachers, and the woman who ran the alterations shop 2 blocks north, and the retired postal carrier, who came every Thursday for the pot roast, because it was the one meal that still tasted the way his late wife used to make it. Arthur knew most of his regulars by name. He knew their dietary restrictions, their anniversaries, which of their kids had just started college. He kept a small chalkboard near the host stand, where he wrote the specials in his own handwriting. And regulars had learned to read between the lines. When the board said slow braised, it meant Arthur had been up since before 4. His wife Carol had died 6 years ago, ovarian cancer, diagnosed in the spring, gone by early winter. She was 38. Their son, Benji, had been 9 years old when she died, old enough to understand what was happening, and young enough that understanding it did not make it easier. In the years since, Arthur had raised Benji the way he ran his kitchen, with consistency, without drama, showing up every single day regardless of whether he felt like it, because showing up was the only parenting philosophy that had ever made sense to him. Benji was 15 now. He did his homework at a corner table in the restaurant, most evenings, earbuds in, occasionally asking Arthur about history assignments or whether a sentence made sense. He bussed tables on weekends without being asked, not because Arthur had pressured him into it, but because Benji had simply observed the rhythm of the place, long enough, that participating in it felt natural. He was, without question, a better person than Arthur deserved to be raising, and Arthur was aware of this. The arrangement with Hargrove Food Group worked. After a fashion, the deliveries came. Arthur worked with what arrived, adapting menus around whatever was actually usable versus what the invoice claimed had been sent. He had become exceptionally skilled at this kind of improvisation. A restaurant critic from Columbus had once described his cooking as having an almost intuitive responsiveness to ingredient, which Arthur had found amusing, because what the critic was actually describing was a man who had learned to make the best of whatever a corporation's logistics department had decided to offload weak. He complained twice in 7 years, once in writing, once by phone. Both times he was directed to a customer service representative, who read from a script, with the enthusiasm of someone who had stopped caring approximately 45 minutes into their first shift. Nothing changed. Arthur continued signing the invoices. He had a son to feed, and a restaurant to keep open, and reliability, even imperfect reliability, mattered more than dignity when those were the terms being offered. He did not know, and had no reason to know, that his modifications, his workarounds, his quietly brilliant adaptations of substandard product into genuinely excellent food, had been noticed, not by Hargrove's executives, who had never visited Millhaven, but by the numbers. By the fact that the Hollow Table had maintained its supplier contract without a single default, without a single formal complaint escalating past the first call, for 7 consecutive years. In an industry where regional restaurant partnerships churned every 18 to 24 months, that was an anomaly significant enough to appear in a data report that very few people actually read. The woman who ran Hargrove Food Group was named Sylvia Crane. She was 51, had an MBA from Wharton, had spent 2 decades building the company from a regional distributor, serving 43 accounts, into a national mid-market food service operation, serving over 4,000. She was profiled in food industry trade publications. She sat on 2 nonprofit boards. She had a gift for systems thinking that bordered on the pathological, meaning she was excellent at understanding how large networks of moving parts connected, and very poor at understanding that some of those parts were human beings, with their own interior lives. Sylvia had not personally reviewed a regional supplier contract in years. She had people for that. She had people for most things. What she did not have, as it turned out, was adequate oversight of the practices those people were implementing in her name. The trouble began, as it often does in large organizations, with a policy that seemed reasonable in isolation. Hargrove's distribution centers had begun routing what they internally called Grade 2 product. Ingredients that had cleared safety thresholds, but not quality ones, towards smaller regional accounts rather than disposing of it. The logic was straightforward. Smaller restaurants had less leverage to complain, less visibility in the market, and were more dependent on the contract. The practice had been formalized quietly by a mid-level logistics manager named Kevin, who received a performance bonus for reducing waste disposal costs by 11%, and did not think very carefully about what reducing waste actually meant in practice. For 7 years, Arthur Dempsey had been one of Kevin's primary solutions. Sylvia did not know about Kevin's system until a Tuesday in March, when everything came apart at once. A food safety investigation initiated by the Ohio Department of Agriculture had flagged Hargrove's Columbus Distribution Center, after 3 separate restaurant partners reported illness clusters among customers. The investigation was not targeting the Hollow Table. Arthur's kitchen was clean. His adaptations had actually made the Grade 2 product safer by processing it more thoroughly, and not a single one of his customers had ever gotten sick. But the investigation pulled supplier records across the entire regional network, and what those records revealed was not merely a safety issue. It was a 7-year pattern of systematic misrepresentation. The story broke on a regional news segment on a Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, it was in the Columbus Dispatch. By Friday, it was national. Hargrove Food Group's stock, which had been publicly traded since 2019, dropped 19% in 2 days. 4 major restaurant chain accounts suspended their contracts pending review. The board of directors called an emergency session. Sylvia, who had been in Dallas for an investor conference, flew back to Ohio overnight. The damage was real and accelerating. Hargrove's legal team was managing the regulatory exposure, but the operational crisis was a different problem. The distribution network had effectively frozen. Accounts were calling to cancel. The logistics infrastructure that Sylvia had spent 20 years building was seizing up in real time, and the people she relied on to stabilize it were either managing their own liability exposure, or had already retained personal attorneys. It was during this period that someone on Hargrove's operations team, running a data pull on accounts that had maintained long-term stability, despite receiving Grade 2 product, flagged the Hollow Table's record. 7 years, 0 defaults, 0 escalated complaints. A pattern of contract renewals that, on paper, looked like loyalty, but was, on closer examination, something more complicated and more impressive. The account had been receiving some of the lowest quality deliveries in the regional network, and producing some of the most consistently satisfied customer outcomes. The name at the bottom of every invoice was Arthur Dempsey. Sylvia read the file on a Friday night in her office, eating takeout she wasn't tasting. She looked at the address in Millhaven. She looked at the delivery logs, she looked at the quality ratings on what had been sent versus what had been invoiced. Then she set the folder down and sat quietly for a while. She had not personally wronged Arthur Dempsey. She would tell herself that for approximately 2 more hours, before she stopped believing it. On a cold Monday morning in early April, a black SUV pulled up in front of the hollow table 40 minutes before Arthur usually unlocked the door. He was already inside. He was always already inside. Benji had an early school thing, a band concert rehearsal, so Arthur had dropped him at 7, and come straight to the restaurant, and he was standing at the prep station, working through a mise en place for the lunch service, when he heard a knock at the glass front door. He did not recognize the woman standing outside at first. She was in her 50s, dark coat, no assistant, no entourage. She looked tired in the way that people look when they have not slept correctly in several days, not just one night. Then it registered. He had seen her face in the trade publications his former business partner used to leave around. He had seen her quoted in an article about food service logistics that someone had sent him 2 years ago as a joke. The headline something about the future of regional distribution, the article not once mentioning that the future of regional distribution had been leaving bruised parsnips and graying chicken thighs on his loading dock for 7 years. Arthur unlocked the door. He did not say anything. Sylvia Crane stepped inside. She looked around the restaurant the way people look at places they expected to be smaller than they are. The hand-painted menus on the chalkboard wall. The mismatched chairs that somehow cohered into something that felt intentional. The smell of stock, already working on the back burner, low and deep and serious. She said she was sorry she had not called ahead. Arthur said there was coffee if she wanted it. She wanted it. He poured 2 cups without asking how she took hers, put both on the prep counter, and went back to his mise en place. The message was not subtle. He was going to keep working, and she could talk while he did, or she could wait. But he was not going to stand still and perform being impressed by the gesture of her arrival. Sylvia did not sit down. She stood on the customer side of the counter and explained what had happened. She did not use the language her legal team had coached her toward. She explained it plainly, because she had decided on the drive up from Columbus that plain was the only register that had any chance of being useful here. She told him what grade 2 product meant. She told him how long the practice had been running. She told him the number on the deliveries that had come to his address. Arthur listened. He kept working. He did not look up from the shallots he was breaking down until she finished. Then he said, "I know." She blinked. "You knew about the grade 2 routing?" "I didn't know what you called it. I knew what you were sending me." He picked up the knife again. "I figured out the pattern in the 2nd year. I thought about canceling the contract. Then Carol got sick. Then she was gone. Then I had a 10-year-old and a restaurant and one supplier I could afford." A pause. He moved to the carrots. "So I worked with what I had." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know about Kevin's system. I'm not saying that to avoid responsibility. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I understand the difference is thin." "It's not thin," Arthur said, "but it doesn't matter right now. What do you need?" That stopped her. She had not expected the question to arrive that quickly. She needed, in fact, quite a lot. Hargrove's crisis had exposed a structural gap in the company's quality verification process. But the deeper problem was that the distribution model itself had calcified around efficiency metrics that had quietly stripped out the human judgment layer. What Sylvia had been watching her operations team fail to articulate all week was that they had optimized for throughput so aggressively that they no longer had anyone in the system who actually understood food, not as a product, as a perishable, variable, living thing that required continuous human interpretation to handle correctly. Arthur understood it that way. He had been understanding it that way for 30 years. She asked if he would be willing to consult on a quality review of Hargrove's regional sourcing protocols. She asked carefully, because she was aware that she had no standing to ask for anything, and that the correct response to her arrival was probably a number of things that did not include helping her. Arthur was quiet for a long time, long enough that Sylvia understood she was not going to be given a quick answer, and she should stop waiting for one. Benji came through the back door at that point, having been dropped off by another parent after rehearsal, backpack over one shoulder, earbuds around his neck. He stopped when he saw a stranger at the counter. He looked at his father, who gave a small nod that communicated nothing was wrong, but said everything else. Benji put his backpack at his usual corner table, got himself a glass of water from behind the counter, with the familiarity of someone who had grown up in this room, and opened a textbook. Sylvia watched this without commenting. She understood she had just witnessed something she was not meant to witness. Not because it was secret but because it was private. A father and a 15-year-old communicating in the abbreviated language of people who have had to figure each other out under difficult circumstances. Arthur said he would think about it. She left her card. He put it under the edge of the cutting board without looking at it, which she understood was not contempt, but was simply the action of a man who already knew where it was. He did think about it. That evening, after the dinner service, after Benji had gone upstairs, Arthur sat in the empty dining room in the dark, and thought about it for a long time. He thought about the 4,000 accounts in Hargrove's network, many of them small restaurants like his, run by people who had also been signing invoices, and adapting, and making it work because they had to. He thought about those people's employees, who had not done anything wrong, and who would lose their jobs if the distribution network collapsed. He thought about Carol, who had an instinct for fairness that had always slightly succeeded his, and what she would have said. He believed he knew. He did not help because Sylvia Crane deserved it. He was not certain she did. He helped because the people downstream of her decisions deserved someone who understood the problem to be involved in fixing it. He called the number on the card the next morning. What followed was 3 months of work that Arthur would later describe, in the plain-spoken way that was his only register, as complicated and necessary. He spent 2 days a week in Columbus, reviewing Hargrove's regional sourcing protocols. He brought to those sessions the kind of practical knowledge that cannot be acquired in graduate school. A working understanding of how product quality degraded along transit timelines, which suppliers' grade 1 product was genuinely reliable, versus which were gaming the rating system, and where in the distribution chain, the quality control gaps were allowing substandard product to enter the rotation. He was not easy to work with, in the sense that he did not perform agreement when he disagreed, did not soften his assessments for the sake of room temperature, and had no interest in the political dynamics of Hargrove's internal departments. He told Sylvia's VP of sourcing, to her face, that the evaluation criteria her team was using for produce quality had apparently been written by someone who had never actually cooked anything, and he offered to rewrite them over the following weekend, and he did. He restructured his schedule around Benji's school calendar without apologizing for it. He left meetings when he needed to leave them. He told Sylvia in their second week of working together that he had a hard stop at 3:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because Benji had a cross-country meet and he had not missed one yet. She scheduled around it. After the first week she stopped noticing that she was doing so, which Arthur considered the appropriate outcome. Sylvia observed him differently in Columbus than she had in Millhaven. In Millhaven, she had seen grief and discipline, and a small restaurant that should have been more visible. In Columbus she watched him in rooms full of people, with advanced degrees and budget authority, who consistently deferred to him, on the questions that actually mattered, not out of hierarchy, but out of the simple recognition that he understood what they were talking about. And most of them understood it only theoretically. She watched him explain the temperature danger zone to a sourcing manager, who had been approving cold chain logistics for 6 years and had never had it explained in terms of what actually happened to the food. The manager's expression changed. Arthur moved on without noting that it had. There was an evening in May when Sylvia drove to Millhaven for dinner at the Hollow Table. She had not announced she was coming. She sat at a table near the window and ordered the braised short rib and a glass of Rhone, and watched the restaurant from the inside. She watched Arthur come out of the kitchen twice to visit tables, both times because something specific had happened. Once because an elderly man had asked about the preparation of a dish, and the server had come back to ask sir, rather than guess. And once because a table of 4 had been celebrating something, and Arthur had sent out a small dessert on the house, without being asked to. Both times he was in the dining room for under 3 minutes, then back to the kitchen. She stayed until the last table cleared. She was the last table. She told him the short rib was the best thing she had eaten in a long time, which was true, and he said thank you without false modesty, which she appreciated. Then she said, I want to offer you something, and I want you to feel completely free to say no, because you've already done more than you had any obligation to do. She had been thinking about a new position at Hargrove, Director of Regional Quality, a newly created role that would give Arthur direct authority over sourcing standards for the entire regional distribution network. Real authority, not advisory. His input would not be filtered through a committee. His assessments would carry operational weight. She described the salary and Arthur was quiet. He asked about the travel expectations. She told him honestly, there would be some, not excessive. He could work predominantly from Ohio. He asked if he could keep the hollow table. She had expected this question. The role is full-time. I know. I'm asking anyway. She thought about it. What if the restaurant went to reduced hours? 4 nights a week. You control the kitchen when you're there. You hire a lead cook to handle the other nights under your direction. Arthur turned this over. Benji would be 17 in 8 months, I know. He's been eating dinner in that kitchen since he was 9, I know that too. They sat with it for a moment. Arthur said, I'll need to talk to him. He did that night, after they had cleaned up, and Benji was at the corner table, finishing something for AP English. Arthur sat down across from him, something he did not usually do, while Benji was working because he respected the workspace. And Benji looked up and removed his earbuds, because Arthur sitting down at his table in the middle of the school week, without preamble, was a signal that whatever was about to be said mattered. Arthur explained the offer. He explained it completely, which was the only way he knew how to explain things to Benji, because somewhere in the years after Carol died, he had made a decision that Benji would be told the true version of things in language calibrated to his age, not a softened version calibrated to Arthur's discomfort. Benji listened without interrupting, then he said, Is this what you want? Arthur said he wasn't sure. He said it was what he was good at, which wasn't exactly the same thing. Benji said, I think you should do it. You've been fixing other people's problems here for 7 years anyway. At least this way they'd have to admit it. Arthur looked at him for a moment. When did you get opinionated? I've always been opinionated, Benji said. You just never gave me an opening. Arthur took the position. He gave the offer a week before accepting, because he had learned from experience that decisions made quickly in restaurants were usually wrong, and he saw no reason to abandon that principle in other areas of life. The transition was not seamless. Nothing real ever is. The hollow table moved to 4 nights of full service, plus a Sunday brunch that Arthur ran personally. A cook named Dottie, who had worked for Arthur for 4 years, and understood the kitchen's philosophy almost entirely without being told, took the lead on the nights Arthur was in Columbus. There were growing pains. There were evenings when Arthur came home from a long day of sourcing reviews, to find that a substitution Dottie had made didn't sit right with him, and he would come in early the next morning, and they would talk it through. There were also evenings when Dottie made a call that Arthur would not have made, and it was, he had to acknowledge, better than what he would have done. At Hargrove, the changes Arthur implemented took effect gradually, which was the only way institutional changes actually take effect. The Grade 2 routing system was dismantled entirely. A new quality evaluation framework, the one Arthur had rewritten over a weekend, became the operational standard for regional sourcing. Supplier audits that had been largely theoretical became actual audits, with photographs and temperature logs, and human beings who had cooked professionally asking questions that the old system had never thought to ask. The 4,000 accounts in Hargrove's regional network started receiving what they had been invoiced for. For some of them, it was the first time this had been true. Sylvia told Arthur in a November meeting that the stabilization of their regional accounts had directly prevented 2 contracts from going to a competitor. She showed him the numbers. He looked at them briefly and said that was good, and moved on to the agenda item about cold chain compliance in the lower Midwest, which was still a problem. She asked him once, in a quieter moment, whether he had fully forgiven her for what the company had done over those 7 years. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. Then he said, "I don't think forgiveness is really the framework. You ran a system that was doing something you didn't know about, and when you found out, you did something about it. That's not forgivable or unforgivable. That's just what happened." She said, "That's a very measured answer." He said, "I've had a lot of practice being measured." On a Tuesday morning the following spring, a Hargrove delivery truck pulled up behind the hollow table at 7:45. The driver's name was Eddie. He had been on the route for 3 weeks. He backed in carefully, killed the engine, and started unloading. Prime produce, cold chain unbroken, product matching the invoice line by line. Arthur was already inside. He came out the back door to check the delivery himself, the way he had always checked deliveries, because that was one habit he saw no reason to change. He went through the items methodically. Checked the temperatures, checked the dates, signed the clipboard. Then he went back inside and started cooking. Benji came downstairs at 8, still in the rumpled state of a 16-year-old, who has not fully committed to being awake, and poured himself orange juice, and sat at his corner table, and looked at his father, who was already deep in the morning prep, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried precision of someone who had been doing this long enough that it had become a form of thinking. "How's the delivery?" Benji asked. "Good," Arthur said. He did not look up. "Everything's exactly what it was supposed to be." Benji nodded and opened his laptop. That was it. No ceremony, no marker on the calendar. Just a man and his son, and a kitchen, where things had gotten quieter, in the way that things get quiet when they are finally, after a long time, working the way they were meant to. The kind of quiet that only makes sense to people who remember what the noise was like. Some people spend years doing excellent work in places that weren't designed to notice them, and sometimes the world catches up, and sometimes it doesn't. But the work was real either way. The meals were real, the people who ate them were real. Arthur Dempsey had known this the whole time. He had simply kept cooking until someone else figured it out.